Well, it's been a long year, hasn't it? It's almost over now. We're almost there. But you gotta admit, it's been kinda silly at the same time. But how silly exactly? But yes, it's time to look back at what Formula One themselves consider to be a silly season with this post they made on social media. I'm going to go through all of these and rate how silly they really are. There are a couple of really silly stories that aren't even on this list, not even as repeats, like Cadillac joining Formula One, General Motors finally getting the deal done, the Andretti bid across the line. That's pretty silly, and that's nowhere near this list. Some people might say, well, that's mainly an FIA story, but come on. Formula One wanted Cadillac, they got it. That's a really big deal, and it's not even there. And also, I would also argue, Louis Vuitton, LMVH, or whatever, replacing Rolex, will actually mean the reintroduction of good old-fashioned champagne to the podium. And finally, I will not have to see the really confusing visage of a Ferrari driver on top of a podium that says Ferrari on it, and yet they're two different Ferraris. I mean, what's up with that? Oh, and I don't want to hear the excuse of, oh, well, it wouldn't look symmetrical now, would it? Because, you know, they could have easily added a couple of extra Behrman stories because Behrman kept breaking the news. I mean, he's only limited like a couple of entries, but I think he had like 6 or 7 this year, didn't he? I am going to be offering my silly season ratings. You can play along as well. I've included a Google form down below in the pinned comments, so you can join me as we go through these stories and I give my opinion, and you can rate them along with me. So for starters, Gunther Steiner leaving Haas. Now already, that's a pretty silly story. It's not the silliest story out there, but considering that we were all expecting Haas to just soldier on for the longest time, it actually happened. This whole story just meant that Haas was free of this cycle of the upgrade path never working. And Ayo Komatsu, albeit a very boring beginning, turned out to be a really competent team principal, and Haas now actually has prospects which look fairly realistic. I wouldn't be surprised if they're in with a shout of beating Aston Martin in 2025. After that, I'm not quite so sure, but I think they might have a good shot of definitely being the best of the rest in 2025, and it all stemmed from Gunther Steiner finally leaving the team that he helped start. So already, we're off to a really big start, and I would say this is pretty silly. 8 out of 10. Then there comes 2 contract extensions, multi-year ones. We're starting to see a really major trend of teams not mentioning how long exactly they're going on for. We can only guess for at least 2 years. There's Charles Leclerc for Ferrari and Lando Norris for McLaren. Now, immediately, they are not really that silly. I mean, Leclerc, I'm going to be like rating 4 out of 10 or something like that. It's good to see him potentially being at Ferrari for over a decade, potentially. It depends on how Lewis Hamilton fares. We'll get to that in a moment. And then Lando Norris at McLaren, well, now at the end of 2024, it would be ridiculous for Lando Norris to go anywhere else. But at the beginning of 2024, we hadn't really seen McLaren become a true top-tier team right at the front of the constructors. So for him to suddenly extend his contract like that and then put to bed any talks of him going to join Max Verstappen at Red Bull, it was a little bit more silly. Like, oh, okay, they decided to get the deal done. So I would rate that about 5 out of 10. It's like, it's interesting, but it's not exactly silly. So I would say Charles Leclerc was a 4 out of 10 and Lando Norris was about 5. But don't worry, it gets silly because right after that, there was Lewis Hamilton leaving Mercedes. Now, immediately, that screams a 9 out of 10. Now, if this were Lewis Hamilton retiring and leaving Formula One, this would have been a really compelling story in of itself, in 2024 being his final season in Formula One. And we would have had this all capped off, no future for him, and him going on to other ventures. And already, that was a really spicy news story, and we were all wondering, well, where is he gonna go? And then eventually, we got our answer just like a day or so later. Not even that. Because we then got the news of Lewis Hamilton joining Ferrari. Now, I can't even put this on the scale. So here's a set of scales, right? And here's a thing. Now, okay, that's off the scale. That's how big a news story that Lewis Hamilton joining Scuderia Ferrari was. I don't think even Lewis Hamilton expected to see in his Formula One career that he would see it out with Mercedes, the entity that helped invest in his karting days way back like 25 years ago or something like that. That's crazy. And now we're starting to see it. And this news story, when it dropped, took over the internet. It's one of those rare stories that probably would have been replicated if the internet were as it is today, back in 96, when Michael Schumacher left Benetton at the end of his contract and went to Ferrari and started off his ambition to help mould the Scuderia into the team it became in the early 2000s. That's how big a story it is. And now, even if Lewis Hamilton doesn't get an 8th world title, it's still a really compelling and thrilling end to a really storied career. And this was probably one of the most defining stories out there. And already, I put out that link, that Google form, and so far, this story is taking an early lead. So if you want to actually join and offer your own opinion, then do join the form below. Then there's the rookie Fernando Alonso re-signing for Aston Martin. Now, this already is kinda zany. I would call this maybe like 6 out of 10 or something like that. It's okay, not the silliest story out there, but you gotta admit that he will be approaching, if he keeps on going, 500 Grand Prix starts, and that is ridiculous for one guy. That is absolutely insane. He will have been in the sport in some shape or form for nigh on 25 years. A quarter of a century is defined by Fernando Alonso. He'll be at that point where he's been in Formula One longer than he has been alive. That is absolutely bonkers. And Aston Martin have not shown any signs of wanting to get rid of him or shifting him off to another department. Because it's Fernando Alonso. If the stars align and he has the right car and he has the right team, then he can still get the results. Win number 33 is very likely in the next couple of years if Aston Martin and Adrian Newey, they really kick on. But it's still up for debate. But at the time, the fact that Aston Martin kept Alonso along and kept going and are showing no signs of wanting to get rid of him, that's pretty zany. It's not the most crazy story out there, but it certainly resonated with me, that's for sure. Then there was Nico leaving Haas. Now, this wasn't really a silly story. It was a bit of an unfortunate one, but one that I did suspect will happen, because the only reason he stayed with Haas for 2024 was because Gunther Steiner, in one of his final acts, decided to activate the option on his contract, so that means he would have to stay with that team. Fortunately for Nico, it turned out to be a really good bet, and Haas turned out to have a bit of a resurgence again. He managed to get some really good points. And then the next story of Nico going to Sauber, that's not silly at all. I predicted that would happen. 2 out of 10 for me. And I would say that it was 5 out of 10 for Nico leaving Haas, because it was like, okay, it's interesting that it happened, but it wasn't really that crazy. And him going to Sauber, even less so. Then there is the news of Adrian Newey leaving Red Bull Racing after nigh on 20 years with the team, his longest stint in Formula One. Now, many people will be suspecting that this was the silliest story going, but at the time, no one was entirely sure where he would be going, or if he would decide to retire and then go and maybe design some yachts or boats or something like that. It was very, very vague. So I'd rate this about like 8 out of 10. It was still pretty crazy that it was actually happening. But given what was going on at Red Bull Racing at the time, and the fact that he'd been there for so long, and Adrian Newey is not one for confrontations and conflict and awkward tension, then I wouldn't be surprised that he was leaving. And it was a long time coming, and he is approaching his late 60s. So it was going to happen in the next few years, especially with him having a diminished responsibility with the Red Bull cars as time progressed. So I wasn't really surprised this would happen, but it was still quite an interesting news bit. And then there was Sergio Pérez getting, in the midst of all the turmoil after the first few races of 2024, that mid-season contract extension. Now, I'm going to illustrate for you what I think in terms of the scales. So it's not only that, but like, no, actually, I need that later. Yeah, I'm not going to break it. Because usually mid-season contract extensions are offered to drivers who are performing as expected. And at that time, Checo was not performing as expected. And ultimately, it led to Max Verstappen attaining a record nigh on 40 years later after his father-in-law effectively got the same record of having won the championship, but the team that he races for was not first or second in the constructors. And that is bonkers. And to have that happen was a really, really jarring bit of news. It was something that nobody expected to happen. Then there's the whole idea of Pierre Gasly extending his contract with Alpine. Now, this one was quite an interesting story, and I thought that this was a case of him not really having anywhere else to go. Alpine was in the doldrums, at least in the public eye, but as we saw toward the end of the season, it's actually turning out to be a bit of a solid bet. Pierre Gasly and Alpine, he's now got the team around him like that. He and the team are now synonymous. They are going to be going places in the next few years, and he is going to be the de facto team leader for many years to come. So he's actually got himself a fairly solid position, being a team leader without question. And at the time, though, I did think it was an interesting choice, and I would probably rate this about like 3 or something like that. It wasn't really surprising. It was almost depressing at the time. It was that rather than being silly. But now it's actually turned out to be pretty decent, so there we go. Then there's Stroll extending his contract, and this doesn't really get a rating. It's not really silly at all. It's more annoying. So that's that really. It's just irritating. It's not silly whatsoever. Then Oliver Behrman joining Haas on a multi-year contract. One of those again. I'm going to rate that a 2 because it's cool that it happened for 2025 because we are going to get nigh on a third of the grid consisting of people who have not done a single full F1 campaign. And that's a really big jump because you go from Liam Lawson at 11 Grand Prix to then Oscar Piastri at 46. That's absolutely bonkers. But anyway, we are getting that situation. It's not really a surprise that Behrman was going to be joining Haas. It was kind of the same deal of a Ferrari Academy driver going to Haas or Alfa Romeo or Sauber or what have you. But with Haas becoming the de facto B team for Ferrari, for at least for the next few years until Toyota really get into bed with them properly with Ayo Komatsu, this was a really solid and inevitable bet that Behrman would get all of this time. The team clearly like him, and they were giving him so many FP1 sessions, it was inevitable. So I'm really not surprised at all. So this wasn't silly, it was to be expected. As was the case for Kevin Magnussen leaving Haas when I finally saw the news that he was going to be leaving the team, that he had been around since 2017, it was inevitable. With Gunther Steiner gone, any semblance of the Steiner effect would be purged from that team. Komatsu is wanting to have his own era defined, and Gene Haas is more than happy to make that happen and to facilitate the transition of Haas being the creation of the Tyrolean person, that being Steiner, and then being into something else entirely that has aspirations to be a more competent and solid Formula One team that stood the test of 2020. And now with Magnussen gone, it allows the team to really set the new phase of the team with Toyota, with Ocon in charge and Behrman being the second. Now, Magnussen gone doesn't really surprise me, but I'm really glad to see that he has got something going for him with a works deal with BMW in sports cars. Now, that is really cool, that he gets a little bit more time with his family, and yet he still gets to be racing around in America. That's really cool. Then there was the idea of Mattia Binotto coming back to Formula One as the Audi project manager. Now, that is pretty silly and really surreal that he would be coming back to that role as effectively a boss of a team, which is something I didn't expect would happen. I would expect that at the time, it would have been more like an engineering role in the back rooms. He wouldn't have to deal with the media. And he sort of got that in a way now that I think about it. But it was still really crazy that after the really awkward divorce with Ferrari, that he came back within 2 years or something like that. But I really suspect that he will be a really good person who is in charge of the power unit division, that he can choose when or when not to be in front of the public eye. Jonathan Wheatley is going to be coming in as the day-to-day team principal, but also can do what he does best and just tinker with the engine, which means that I think that that power unit that Audi's going to be providing will be a really solid unit. Ocon joining Haas, though, as I touched upon earlier, not so much really, because I predicted that in my 2025 driver lineup predictions, that Ocon would find a whole new lease of life with the American-based team, or American, Italian, England, what have you, but Gene Haas's team. I suspected that he would end up there because, as has become clear now, Alpine and him were seriously not getting along, and I think Esteban will thrive with a team that really has his best interests at heart, and Komatsu really values the French driver. So therefore, I think we will see the best of Esteban in the next few years, and that Haas will get their first podium with Esteban there, because they're going to listen to him. They're going to be taking him seriously, and he will flourish because he's not having to bang his head against a wall with a team that doesn't respect him, and neither does he respect the team, and it's just a really awkward situation that nothing really gets done, and then Pierre Gasly gets favoritism or something like that. So now it's going to be a much more relaxed generation of Haas with Esteban in charge. So this story, though, didn't really surprise me at all. 2 out of 10. But a story that really surprised me, Carlos Sainz joining Williams. Now that is a straight up 10, because everyone's been going, oh no, it's the death of Carlos Sainz's career. Williams has no hope for getting up there. No, come on. No, I suspect that Williams will be up there as a solid team in the next couple of years, and it's really clear that the evidence was compelling for Carlos to join them, and it's not a case of Red Bull or Mercedes not wanting Carlos, it's just there was no place for him because both those teams had a clear plan for the future. Red Bull, with Christian Horner, wanted to try and motivate Checo, and then eventually get Liam Lawson into the seat. If it were Helmut Marko, up to him, then Carlos would be right there next to Max Verstappen, so he can get one of his old junior drivers back with them. And then with Mercedes, come on. Toto wants Kimi in the car, and he will do anything possible that means he can have his own little Max Verstappen, albeit an Italian version. And despite the fact that Carlos Sainz Sr. had affiliations with the likes of Audi in his Dakar rally and all of those other ventures, he's now moved over to Ford, which many people were thinking, well, okay, maybe Carlos was destined to go there. But then clearly that didn't happen because we got that mid-season contract extension experiment with Checo, which fell flat. Now we got Lawson. So Carlos decided to go with a team that absolutely wanted him, and I feel like they will actually be a match made in heaven, and that Carlos's efforts will work well with Alex to be able to get that team back to where it should be, scoring solid points consistently at minimum. This Williams lineup of Albon and Sainz is the most solid lineup they've had, that team, since maybe arguably Bottas and Massa, certainly Webber and Heidfeld of 2005. Then there's Bruno Faman being sacked by Alpine. 3 out of 10. Because I thought it was pretty wild and also really cathartic, because that man completely crushed Alpine, ruined Alpine, completely tainted the work of Otmar Safnauer. So this wasn't silly per se. I was expecting that this would happen because he wasn't really doing anything for that team other than just getting rid of people, all the work that Safnauer did to make it a fairly competent division. So I'm just mainly like, this felt good, this felt cathartic rather than silly. And then Oliver Oakes joining Alpine. The initial results I've seen, people don't view this as a silly story, but I think it's a pretty zany one. 8 out of 10, I would say. Because Oliver Oakes coming from high tech to then take over with Flavio Briatore, it's clear that this team's identity is going to be changing in the fullness of time. It's not going to be owned by Renault in the next a year or 18 months or so. I think it's going to become high-tech Grand Prix with Oliver Oakes in charge, having had some time to bed himself in and get the right people that he wants there. And Paul Aaron as their reserve driver, it's inevitable. Jack Doohan having the sword of Damocles right above him, that's inevitable that he's going to lose that seat unless he is right close to Pierre Gasly or matching him. Let's be real here. Jack is living on borrowed time, and that is absolutely not fair. But this story in of itself was a really big eyebrow raiser. It made me think, oh, okay, all right. Alpine does have aspirations after all, as is the case with Jonathan Wheatley leaving Red Bull to then join the Audi project. I'm going to be rating this a 5 out of 10 or something like that because I believe that Wheatley has talked that one day he would like to be a team leader or something like that. And the opportunity came with Audi, with Mattia Binotto in the back rooms, Jonathan Wheatley being in the front rooms, and I think this could be a really, really potent working relationship. This is perfect because Wheatley knows the sport inside and out. And at the same time, though, I wouldn't call this a surprise because it's been talked about, but it's certainly a very interesting phenomena, and I'm glad that it has happened. Then Jack Doohan becoming an Alpine driver next to Pierre Gasly, I would call that a solid 7 out of 10. That is pretty crazy, because no one was expecting Jack to actually get the gig. I'm really happy for the guy. And if Mick Schumacher weren't to get that seat, at least it was a Doohan, which is absolutely fine by me. And I want him to have a go and be solid. In Abu Dhabi, he was really competent. He wasn't really dragging the team down, but it was certainly a lot of pressure for Flavio Briatore to chuck the Australian in at a point where Alpine were wanting to lock in 6th place in the Constructors, and they decided to throw in a rookie at the final race when points really meant a lot. But hey, Jack didn't drown, so that is something. But the news of him becoming a 2025 driver, certainly a bit of an oddball choice, a bit of a surprise, but hey, fair play to him. Good luck, Jack. Then Logan Sargent, him leaving Williams immediately after Zandvoort. That's a 3 out of 10. I mean, it was a bit of a surprise for him to be dropped mid-season, but it was kind of inevitable, so I don't really have much else to say, really. It was unfortunate, it was sad, but it was going to be happening, but I thought it would have happened at the end of the season. 2 years, and then that would have been as well. But then Franco Colapinto joining Williams immediately for the Grand Prix afterwards, that in of itself, that is a full-on 10 out of 10. That became one of the defining stories of the season. And even though Colapinto's day ended on a bit of a bum note with all of those crashes, some of them not his fault per se, I still think this was a story that captured the heart of the fandom, and the initial story of him just getting the seat out of nowhere. We got this guy who was in F2, he was alright, nobody expected him to get the promotion to F1, and he actually performed. Cool. It was a pleasant surprise. He actually out-qualified Alex for the first time in like a couple of years or something. Certainly gave him pause for thought. But what didn't give me pause for thought was Kimi Antonelli racing for Mercedes in 2025, that being finally confirmed. Still a 6 out of 10 though, that they're actually going to go along with this, instead of doing another season of F2 to really get himself used to a car, and for Prema to actually get their act together, because clearly they were not handling the new F2 car for 2024, neither were other teams. But I do find it really interesting that they are very much Mercedes trying to get the right image and allowing a lot of time in the off-season for people to really start to assess Kimi as being something of a really interesting wunderkind, because he didn't take part in Abu Dhabi after Mercedes said that he was too ill to race, so they didn't want his stock to potentially fall, according to some. People were doubting that. And then he actually managed to get similar times to Lewis Hamilton in W15 in testing. Can't take testing times too seriously, but he was certainly not far off. And in a couple of FP1 sessions after the one in Monza, his times were near the higher ones of the rookies who were doing FP1 sessions. That is going to be one of the defining stories of 2025. And even though I don't think he's going to be a championship contender, him maybe getting a Grand Prix win, maybe. Then there's the news of Adrian Newey joining Aston Martin. Straight up, 10 out of 10. Everyone was thinking it was going to be Ferrari, myself included. Williams might have been a bit of a long shot, but certainly plausible for him to go back there. But ultimately it was Aston Martin. But it really shouldn't have surprised me, but it certainly did. Because he is going there for the money. He really, really is. Because that paycheck he's going to be getting every year, it's mighty, it's immense. And Fernando Alonso is right there. It's going to be a really bonkers story that's going to take some time to cook. 2025, don't really expect anything from those two. 2026 though, it's going to be cool. Then Ricciardo leaving VCARB mid-season, that I'm going to say is an 8 out of 10 because no one expected that to happen. That maybe Liam Lawson would have gotten his chance for 2025, but the whole Singapore situation was such a wet blanket almost. Like, it was depressing and bleak that Daniel didn't get a really big send-off or something like that. But then Liam Lawson, that story of him joining VCARB, that's a 4 out of 10 really. Because if anyone was going to be replacing Daniel, it was going to be Liam, and he was going to be getting another few races to be able to prove himself, and then they would consider their options for 2025. So that story was certainly a lot less silly than Daniel Ricciardo leaving, and now it's quite clear that Daniel's not going to be coming back. And then what is quite possibly the least silly story of the season, Bottas and Zhou leaving Sauber. Because the management that took those drivers on had long since departed Fred Vasseur going to Ferrari, so their time there was going to be limited, because according to Andreas Seidel and ultimately Mattia Binotto, those two drivers were not part of the Sauber/Audi story, no matter how many times Valtteri was trying to convince us all that that was the case. And Zhou might find some luck as a reserve driver elsewhere, but this story, this coming out, did not surprise me at all. But what did surprise me more though was Bortoleto taking the punt with Sauber, and not maybe doing a year as McLaren's reserve driver. But don't get me wrong, I'm glad that he's going to be getting a race seat, and Brazil will have someone representing them again for the first time in many, many years. I'm really happy he's getting his chance. I'm going to be supporting him all the way, because I think Gabriel is a really good kid and somebody to watch. He is consistent. That Monza performance in F2, man, last year, wow, so good. But the fact that it's actually going to be happening and we get another rookie, that's at least a 6 out of 10. And then what was really wild was Ocon being dropped by Alpine with only one race to go. That was certainly an 8 out of 10, because no one expected that to happen, that he would at least see his time out with the team for the rest of the season, especially after getting second place in Brazil. But then Doohan becoming his replacement for Abu Dhabi, no, not silly at all, 1 out of 10. But then Perez leaving Red Bull Racing after getting that contract extension anyway, so that was completely nulled and voided. Well, yeah, that's all I've got to say, really. And then Lawson joining Red Bull Racing, 8 out of 10. It was a surprise that Yuki Tsunoda didn't get the gig, but it was good to be happening, because in my video from yesterday, I certainly think that Lawson is too big to fail, and Red Bull wants to make sure that he is their future team leader if Max Verstappen should leave earlier than expected. Valtteri Bottas becoming Mercedes reserve driver, 9 out of 10. I didn't expect him to get that gig again, but I am glad to see that he might be able to retain some of his quirky identity of him being a reserve or effectively adopted Australian. that Mercedes are going to be maintaining that and not asking him to change back again. Mercedes are going to be certainly a lot more fun team going forward post-Hamilton, and I'm glad that Valtteri will be a part of that. And then Isaac Achar joining V-Carb. I mean, it's not really silly, really. It was to be expected, but certainly a surprise that he was getting the gig, even though he didn't win the World Championship in F2. 4 out of 10. There you go. So based on these results, I would say the season was pretty silly. It could have been sillier, but it certainly had zany stuff that punctuated the year along the way, such as Lewis going to Ferrari, Colapinto joining Williams right out of the blue, and Adrian Newey signing for Aston Martin. By the way, if you're interested to play along, go and check out the form below in the pinned comments. That means you can offer your thoughts, and I will share them in a future video or on some sort of social post. But in the meantime, why don't you take a look at my predictions I had for the championship standings for 2024? Were they an improvement on 2023's? Well, you can go and find out right now in this video here that you can watch straight away.